Hey gang, it's Squill, and another year, another batch of new Futurama episodes, baby. I went into Futurama's 9th production season and 12th broadcast season, expecting it to be about on the same level as last year's episodes. A group of mostly decent stories with only one or two standouts, but at the same time only one or two duds. Instead, what I got was not only a solid improvement upon last year's episodes, but quite possibly the best run of Futurama since the Fox era. It really feels like the crew found their footing this year, with some incredibly inspired stories and meaningful character writing. There are a lot of really interesting episodes this year that I'm very excited to discuss. But before we can get into any of those, we unfortunately have one dud episode to cover, which just so happens to be the season premiere. And it is quite the doozy. Episode 1, the One Amigo. Alright, let's address the elephant in the room. The NFT stuff in this episode sucks hard. The first 5 minutes of this episode features some of the most unfunny writing Futurama has ever had. It's rough. You see, that joke is that nobody really knows why NFTs are valuable. And it feels super dated too. I haven't heard a single person talk about NFTs in like 2 years. And while the worst of this episode is definitely contained within the first 5 minutes, it's not like they exactly let up on the NFT stuff after the opening act. Really, the only good thing to come out of the NFT stuff in this episode is seeing all the references to previous Bender outfits at the end. I'm not particularly invested in Bender's character journey in this episode. This is partially because it largely hinges on the awful NFT stuff. But it's also partially because the show's just done this Bender existential crisis storyline so many times before, and it's done it so much better. Including the Bender story we got literally 1 episode ago. I think the Bender family angle this story takes is interesting conceptually, but it gets wasted on what is still largely an episode about NFTs. I like the dynamic Bender has with his abuela, but it feels like it should be expanded upon more. Like, I don't really get a strong sense of what this family means to Bender. They almost do something interesting with Bender not remembering his mom, but all that results in is a joke about how uninteresting she was. So when the family betrays Bender, it doesn't leave much of an impact at all. Hell, Bender himself doesn't seem to care. And then the episode just goes back to the NFT stuff, yippee. The most I really got out of the storyline is that this hoops tournament is kind of fun. I love that they're still using the CGI Bender model, it's so funny. The NFT heist subplot unfortunately suffers from the same issues as the main plot. Like, there's some kind of fun stuff here, but it feels so rushed and underdeveloped. And it doesn't help that they already have a much better heist episode. And once again, it all just comes back to the NFT stuff. The One Amigo is an episode with good ideas that unfortunately gets bogged down by a frustrating focus on NFTs. Say what you will about last year's vaccine episode, but at least it didn't waste an otherwise good premise. I await next year's ChatGPT episode. Episode 2, Quiz Game. Alright, now we're getting into the good stuff. Quiz Game is a great episode. This one has such a fun premise as the characters are forced to play party games to the death. A part of what makes this episode so fun is just a wide cast of characters here. Easily the biggest out of any Futurama episode. With my personal favorite inclusion being the robot gypsy, such a random character to put here. And what's even more fun is just watching them all horrifically die. And obviously we all know that none of these characters are gonna stay dead. Like, I don't really see how the show functions with the cat lady being the only character. But there's still something very morbidly funny about watching all these beloved characters get killed off one by one. The best death of the episode is easily the professor's. But alongside all that fun stuff, this is another in a series of episodes exploring Fry's past. This one dealing with how Fry lost his friends after his parents cheated for him. We even learned that Fry was once friends with Geji, that nerdy kid from Cold Warriors. And in the present day scenes, we see that Fry still has trauma from being accused of cheating. Fry, pre-being frozen, is pretty consistently portrayed as a social outcast. I mean, the premise of the show only really works if Fry didn't have anything to lose by going into the future. So it's cool to get a bit of context as to why Fry was such an outcast. But I think what makes this story stand out from other Fry flashback episodes is its ending. Typically, episodes like these will end on a more uplifting note, with Fry gaining some amount of closure with the people from his past. Jurassic Bark is famously an exception to this rule. But even there, Fry made the active choice not to bring Seymour back, thus giving him some amount of resolution. But this episode, on the other hand, kind of ends on a bummer. Like, okay, we learned that Fry's parents were helping him cheat, which is a nice gesture, but Fry himself never learns this, only us the audience do. On an artistic level, I really respect the decision not to give Fry closure here. It makes the story emotionally hit you in a way that feels different from the other Fry flashback episodes. Quid's Game is another hit in a series of episodes that never seems to miss. Easily one of the best episodes from this particular batch. Episode 3, The Temp. While most of my favorite Futurama episodes tend to be more emotionally driven, The Temp absolutely succeeds in telling a high-concept sci-fi story. From the cold opening alone, I was hooked on this episode. It's the first cold opening they've had since, like, early season 2, I think. But it's used super effectively here. It does an excellent job setting up the mystery of who this guy is and why everyone's convinced he's Fry. And the rest of the episode makes excellent use of non-linear storytelling, constantly jumping back and forward in time, slowly trickling us more information until we have the full context as to what's going on. And it's funny, because this episode's storyline isn't particularly unique to Futurama. I've seen plenty of shows do the character gets replaced by a doppelganger plot, but this episode shows that the way a story is told can often make up for a less engaging plot. This episode also ties back into the Amazonian woman episode in a pretty fun way. I'm not even that crazy about that particular episode. I honestly think it's kind of overrated. But the way this episode continues off of that one is honestly pretty clever. And it's fun to imagine the extended flashback in this episode taking place shortly after the Amazonian woman episode. I love that the in-universe explanation as to why these events are never referenced again is that the temp guy is just so forgettable that nobody remembers. To the point where the crew literally forgets what their plan was in the climax of the episode. That was a great bit. Speaking of which, this temp character might be one of my new favorite one-off characters in all of Futurama. This average, boring guy who gets taken in by the excitement of working for Planet Express. I think it's cool seeing a character with a fresh, new perspective on the kind of life Fry has. It reminds you how lucky Fry was to come to the future. Like, the more Futurama goes on, the more you kind of forget that it was originally a fish-out-of-water show. Because the longer Fry lives in the 3000s, the more he naturally becomes accustomed to things. So this episode serves as a good reminder for both Fry and us the audience not to take our lives for granted. And I like that it's Fry's connection with Leela that's able to convince everyone that he's the real Fry. The Temp is a great episode, easily one of my favorites from the Hulu era so far. Episode 4, Beauty and the Bug. This is our second Bender-focused episode this season, and centers around him becoming a bug-fighting matador. I think the coolest aspect of this episode is all the Buggalo lore we get. We learn that there are these male Buggalo that are all black. We learned that Buggalo can communicate and form a hive mind when in large quantities. And we learned that the Buggalo have a deep love for Buggalo fighting. It's just cool to get some more info about a species that we've seen a lot in Futurama, but didn't really know too much about. This episode is also really cool and distinct looking on a visual level. Some really gorgeous backgrounds here. The Bender Matador stuff is fun too, though I don't really have a ton to say about it. It's sorta just another Bender gets a wacky new hobby type episode, but it still works. I feel the same way about Bender's romance with his mentor, whose name I'm not even gonna try to say. She's a fine character, but there's nothing about their relationship that really stands out compared to other Bender romances. This isn't really a criticism, but I gotta say, when I first watched this episode, I was really expecting it to be more of an Amy episode, just with the way her activism is set up in the first scene. And I suppose she still is, like, the third most important character in the episode, but it's definitely way more of a Bender episode. Beauty and the Bug isn't one of my favorites of the season, but it's still entertaining. At the very least, it's definitely worth it for all that sweet Buggalo lore. Episode 5, One is Silicon, the Other Gold. This is an episode that I really liked on my first viewing, but on rewatch, think is just okay. Conceptually, I really liked the idea of Leela making new female friends. But in execution, I guess I just don't really buy Leela's connection with any of these other characters. I get what the show is saying, that shared traumatic experiences can bring people closer together, but it feels like the show was just telling me that they all became friends, rather than actually showing it naturally. Like, outside of maybe Amy, I seriously doubt that Leela's friendship with any of these other characters will be shown in any future episode. Oh, and that twist was super obvious. Like, the instant this new character showed up on screen, I was able to predict that she's also the chatbot. But speaking of which, unlike the NFT jokes in the season premiere, I actually think the chatbot stuff in this episode is handled quite well. It feels like a pretty natural part of the story, as opposed to just hijacking a plot it should have nothing to do with. I don't really have much of an opinion on the Inferno Fest stuff in Act 1. It had some good jokes, but it feels way too late for the show to be mocking the Firefest incident from 2017. It at least does a good job setting up the idea of trauma bringing people closer together. My favorite part of this episode was easily this book club subplot. I enjoyed the subversion that the men's book club actually cared more about reading than the women's book club. A lot of good jokes here. But overall, while not a bad episode, I do think this is one of the weaker episodes of this batch. Episode 6, Attack of the Clothes. Funnily enough, this episode kind of went in the exact opposite trajectory for me as the last one. Being that, while at first I thought the episode was just okay, on rewatch I actually quite like it. I guess on first viewing, I thought the professor being super into fashion was sort of random, but I think it's at least set up well in the first act. And the professor's always had somewhat of a creative side, so it's not too far out of question. I think this one has some pretty good commentary on the fashion industry too. How people will dress a certain way not because they actually like it, but just to follow trends. Then proceed to discard said clothes once the trend is over, while at the same time shunning those who can't keep up with it all. I was initially kind of put off by this episode ending abruptly without a resolution, but I think I've come to respect it on an artistic level. It's like a cautionary tale. While I didn't have a ton to say about it, I think Attack of the Clothes is pretty solid as a whole. Episode 7, Planet Espresso. Planet Espresso serves as this season's Hermes-focused episode, exploring the relationship he had with his father. I think this one does a pretty good job tackling generational trauma. How Hermes inadvertently pushes his family away in favor of work, the same way his father did to him. For better and for worse, children will inherit certain traits from their parents. It was bittersweet to see Hermes reconcile with his father and learn what he's been doing wrong. This honestly might be Hermes' best episode as a whole, lots of great character work with him. I also enjoyed all the lore surrounding these coffee aliens, who, as it turns out, are planning on using the coffee to enslave people. Love that last shot of them on the Starbucks logo. This Fry subplot is also pretty funny. The rest of Planet Express going on strike against Fry is probably my favorite gag in the episode. Planet Espresso is a very strong emotional episode for Hermes, and one of the best of the season. Episode 8, Cuteness Overlord. And now for probably the most average episode of the season. Which is a shame, because I was looking forward to another episode focused on Amy and her kids. But I just didn't care for this Beanie Baby story. It's hard to put my finger on because there's not really anything actively wrong with this episode. I guess I just didn't find the story engaging enough or the jokes funny enough. Like, the twist that these Beanie Babies are actually alien parasites is okay, but nothing that crazy. Really like the scene of Zap and Kif discovering it though, very freaky. And I find Amy's character journey in this one to be similarly just alright. I think the way Amy neglected her kids in this episode was maybe a little over the top. I don't know, we haven't really seen her act this way before, it felt a little forced. Honestly, the scene that got the biggest reaction out of me in this episode was when they just show Bart Simpson on screen for like a good 10 seconds. Obviously, Futurama has referenced The Simpsons before, this isn't exactly anything new. But I don't know, something about the way they just hold on it for so long, it feels so jarring to me. I guess it also doesn't help that he's pretty off-model here. But overall, Cuteness Overlord is just alright. A perfectly watchable episode, but not one I see myself going back to all that much. Episode 9, The Futurama Mystery Library. Great, another lame, boring-ass, stupid anthology episode. Okay, I actually really like this one. Yeah, I don't know, something about this one just felt so much more inspired to me than most of the other anthologies. Probably because they feel like actually well-told stories, and not just, what if the Futurama cast were all animals, or what if they were all toys? Instead, this one places all the characters in these mystery novels, a far more interesting gimmick. The Nancy Drew segment is probably my least favorite of the three, but still a lot of fun. There's some good commentary here with the way those books tend to stereotype certain groups of people. The Tintin segment is my favorite of the three, albeit mostly for its art style, which admittedly reminds me more of Adventure Time than Tintin. Love the design of the Zoidberg dog. But this one also has probably the best mystery of the three. But the Encyclopedia Brown segment is probably the funniest of the three. Neil deGrasse Tyson explaining that the bags of poop came from the Big Bang is so unsatisfying that it's amazing. Might be my favorite joke of the entire season, to be honest. And speaking of guest stars, LeVar Burton is really fun in his wraparound segment. This is easily one of the best Futurama anthology episodes. I was very pleasantly surprised by how much I liked this one. Episode 10, Otherwise. This is our 5th, but not final Futurama episode to act as a possible finale for the series. Of course, we already know this isn't the finale, and that they're getting at least 20 more episodes. However, this episode was still written with the intent to potentially be a series finale, and I think it mostly works. Also, I just want to point out how funny it is that this episode aired the exact same day as the supposed Simpsons finale. I really like the way this episode uses the Planet Express ship as a metaphor for the show itself. The Planet Express ship is such an iconic part of the show, it's been a part of it since day one. So I like how big this send-off feels, even if it ends up being a fake-out. This episode also dips its toe a bit into the multiverse, a concept that is very prevalent in media nowadays. I mean, I of all people should know, but I like how low-key this episode is about it. I mean, technically the whole episode takes place in an alternate universe, and we'll talk more about that later. But we only find that out at the very end. It also helps that the show has dabbled in the multiverse before, with the classic Farnsworth paradox. I really like the way this episode follows up the previous series finale episode, Meanwhile, as this is the first almost finale to be a sequel episode to a previous almost finale. I remember being confused while watching The Impossible stream last year as to why Fry just doesn't remember wanting to marry Leela. So I'm glad that this episode reconciles that by revealing that the entirety of Meanwhile's events are just erased from Fry's mind. I think my biggest criticism of this episode is that I feel like the Bender versus the can opener stuff is a little out of place. It's definitely funny, don't get me wrong, and it's not a huge deal. I guess I just feel like this episode is pretty stuffed as is, and it didn't really need this Bender subplot. But man, I really love that Fry and Leela wedding. Seeing the two kiss right as they're about to be blown up is such a powerful image. I'm really glad this episode kept up the Futurama finale tradition of having an excellent Fry and Leela core. Let's talk about the reveal in this episode, that most of what we saw took place in an alternate universe. On the one hand, I do think that makes this episode a little weaker as a finale, because we aren't following the versions of the characters that we know and love. But at the same time, they still feel like the characters. This still feels like how our Fry and Leela would react in this situation. And without that alternate universe angle, we couldn't get that amazing sequence of the two getting married right as they're about to be blown up. And that final scene we do get of the real Fry and Leela is absolutely wonderful. I am glad this episode isn't the finale, but if it was, I think I'd still be mostly satisfied with it. Maybe in the next series finale we'll see Fry and Leela get married for real. Before discussing the season as a whole, let's go ahead and rank its episodes. Number 10, The One Amigo. Number 9, Cuteness Overlord. Number 8, One is Silicon, the Other Gold. Number 7, Beauty and the Bug. Number 6, Attack of the Clothes. Number 5, The Futurama Mystery Library. Number 4, Planet Espresso. Number 3, Otherwise. Number 2, Quiz Game. And number 1, The Temp. I'm sure some people will disagree with me calling The Temp the best episode of this season. I guess to me it just feels like the most unique episode of this batch. Like, we have other emotional Fry flashback episodes, and we have other big Fry and Leela focused finales, but there just isn't an episode that's structured quite like The Temp, even if it doesn't carry that same emotional weight as the previous two. But overall, I was very pleasantly surprised by this batch of 10 episodes. It really feels like the crew found their footing again here. Not that last year's episodes were bad or anything, just quite a bit more hit or miss than this year's. I will say though that I don't think any episode from this year was better than last year's season finale. And I might have liked that Xmas episode more than The Temp as well, but I'm a little on the fence on that one. But this season was consistently stronger than last year's, so that's not really a negative. An overall very strong group of episodes. I'm excited to see what the Futurama team has cooking for next year. Have a good one, and Squill out.